Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So this week, the passage has inspired me to think about the miracle stories. And the miracle stories are controversial. I know some people who deny them altogether. I know others who are all about miracles, and the more magical and fantastical, the better. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because I'm going to lay what I think out. But the thing that bothers me about miracles is that depending on how we read them, we can set ourselves up for disappointment, or we can let ourselves off the hook for action. I think the Gospels are very action-oriented. But how can they be action-oriented if a major part is reserved for Jesus alone? And how do we feel about ourselves and our faith if we're not able to perform miracles? I think at least a few of you are probably wondering if I've gone off the deep end this morning, and that's okay. So let me just state where I am with miracles. If God is who God says, or who we say God is, then sure, they're possible. And if Jesus is who we say he is, then if anyone can perform miracles, it's going to be him. And after that, I don't think about it a whole lot, because it's a 2,000-year-old book. But generally, I don't think it's actually in either of the two's best interest to perform a lot of miracles. You see, a key factor in our faith is that we have to choose God's vision for our world. God is not going to force it on us, because forcing paradise on someone automatically makes it not paradise. And if that's the case, I really think that God wants us to do the work as much as possible. So I kind of think divine intervention is a last resort. God wants us to have buy-in to God's vision. Now, as for Jesus, his ministry was limited from day one. If he was the one going around fixing everything, just laying his hands on people and fixing everything, then when he was crucified, that was the end of things being fixed. Instead, he was training people to go out and train others to change the world. It doesn't make sense that Jesus would go around doing all the heavy lifting when it's possible for us to do it, and paradise is only paradise if we choose it. We can't perform miracles, can we? I think that depends on your definition of miracle. Jesus did teach the disciples to perform miracles, and we've got, stories about that. So there was an obvious expectation that we would carry on that work. They teach the next generation, the next generation, the next generation, all the way up to us. But what counts as a miracle? And perhaps most importantly, how do you translate first century language and understanding to modern day? Personally, I consider modern medicine a miracle. Certain technology and discoveries I consider miracles. Are they magic or fantastical? Certainly to a first century person, they would be. I think for some of you I might have a pretty loose definition of miracles, but it definitely makes a lot of sense to me to have that loose definition. So when I come to a miracle story in the Gospels, my question is always, what was Jesus' intention? He heals a lot of people, but there are a lot of people he doesn't heal as well. So why? On the one hand, I think a lot of these stories are about compassion rather than healing. Take the wedding at Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine. He wanted to keep the event going. He was fostering human relationship building and joy, compassion. If he's made a personal connection with someone or something, he just, I don't think, could help himself. He's the ultimate embodiment of love and compassion. So once that connection's made, I think he just was powerless and he had to do it. The other intention I see is drawing attention to something. So a sign. The resurrection, for example, is the ultimate sign of what the gospel is trying to accomplish. If God is going to make a show of something, that's going to be it. And it certainly got attention, because here we are 2,000 years later. But what about the other stories? And today's story is one of these, because he's hiding. He's in Tyre. He's hiding low in a house. He's not looking for attention. He's not looking to make a sign. He certainly doesn't seem to like this woman very much, and he's been hiding from her and people like her. So what's going on here? And what I'd like to do this morning is give a moment to model thinking creatively and differently about these stories. Not that this is the final say, but just I think sometimes it's really useful to try and think about it from a different angle and just wonder what that tells us. So the first thing I want to talk about is to point out the order of the stories in the Gospels. The Gospel writers did not know what order everything happened in. Mark was the earliest Gospel, and he was writing 40 years later kind of thing. They just knew that it began with Jesus' baptism and ended with the resurrection, and they could make educated guesses about the middle, but they didn't actually know. It's thought that the pre-runners to the Gospels were really just like lists or bullet points about Jesus' teachings and actions in no particular order. So Mark has probably ordered his Gospel with the goal of trying to tell us something. So it's important to look at the stories around it and see what the sort of section theme is. And if you look at our reading today from the lectionary, you'll see that it's 2 out of 3 miracle stories that are sandwiched between confrontations with the Pharisees. In the first conversation, the Pharisees criticize Jesus and the disciples for not following Jewish cleanliness laws. In the second conversation, the one bookending it, they demand a sign from Jesus. And in between, Jesus goes through Tyre, where he heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, and on his way back down, he heals a blind and mute man before feeding 4,000 people. If those things aren't signs enough for the Pharisees, I don't know what is. But I think that's kind of the point Mark's getting at. Now, another thing about Mark, and it's really strong in this passage, is something called the Messianic Secret. Most times when Jesus does something that shows he's the Messiah, afterwards he swears people to secrecy. It doesn't happen in any of the other Gospels, but it happens a lot in Mark. I think it happens like 3 times in this passage alone. There's a lot of theories surrounding why this might be. None can be proved because it's hard to do. Personally, I just think he couldn't do his work with people crowding around him in the way that he would have gotten attention. Also, I think the timing of his death and resurrection are really important, and so too much attention too early would mess that timing up. So I think it's important that he laid low for a while. Now, I bring this up because it seems awfully likely to me that when Jesus is up in Tyre, I think he's hiding out. He's just had a clash with the Pharisees, and they're quite powerful people. He's got people clinging on to him for healing and other such things. I think he's laying low. Remember that his ministry was about 3 years long, but if you sort of read the Gospels in one go, it seems like it's a couple of weeks, like it's just story. But there was days of walking and doing other things, and it was 3 years. So there's definitely downtime. And I think that's important because of the fact that Jesus does not feed, heal, or show signs to everyone. He picks and he chooses. And I think he almost resists doing it in the first place. This is the man who recognized that the poor would always be with us. He says that explicitly. So why did he focus on this handful of people in the Gospels? So the Syrophoenician woman finds him, and she has a young daughter possessed by a demon and wants Jesus to heal the daughter. And Jesus replies with what is usually thought to be a racial slur against Gentiles. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But he says, don't take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. It's often thought the traditional reading is the children are the children of God, i.e. Israel, and the dogs are the Gentiles. The woman replies that even dogs eat crumbs from the children's table, and the woman's daughter is healed. The next story is Jesus finding a man that's deaf and mute and has a speech impediment. And Jesus takes the man off and privately heals him. And finally, after that, Jesus feeds 4,000 people for the second time in a couple of chapters because they followed him out away from home and not brought enough food again. So like I said, the basis of my thoughts for this week is an exercise. Because I wanted to think about how I would interpret these passages. And I've preached on these passages before. You've heard my theories on them. And they're different. But how would I interpret these passages if I didn't treat them like miracle stories? Or perhaps I should say traditional miracle stories. Because they're certainly miraculous, regardless of how the end was achieved. So to begin with, for all the discussion and reading in we do about the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman, as she's sometimes called, I actually think the story makes a ton of sense if we simply take it at face value. This is a story that dumbfounds scholars because the way Jesus treats the woman is so out of character. He's rude, and he uses legitimate racial slur. Tons and tons is written on it, and a lot of wide-ranging meanings are applied to it. I want to ask the teachers in the room here, if a child is behaving poorly, what's one of the first things you think about in your classroom? Especially if maybe you don't have a lot of respect for the parent. Elizabeth?
You think of why, what has happened before the child came to school. There must be a reason.
So I'm just going to repeat that so everybody hears. Elizabeth thinks, okay, why? What's happened before the child's come to school? And we're talking about food here, right? We're talking about throwing the bread to the dog. So if the child's behaving demonically, and maybe we're thinking about other reasons, why might that be? What if they're not eating right? Could this be simply a story about negligent parenting? The more I sat with this passage and sort of thought about it this way this week, I thought, what if the woman was feeding herself well and her child was only getting scraps? Certainly not unheard of even today. You know, we keep hearing about residential schools, and that was one of the issues in residential schools. But definitely, that would have been common in the first century when, quite frankly, it was common to leave unwanted children in the woods to die. They didn't value life the way we did today, and specifically children. If Jesus knew that the woman at the well had 7 husbands, somehow he knew that, would he not know what the woman's relationship with her daughter was? And then, would his reaction not be more appropriate? Maybe it has nothing to do with her being a Gentile. They certainly talk for more than the 2 lines that we have here. The woman's reply that even dogs eat the crumbs from the children's table, I think that would show a significant change in heart in this context. And that change in heart would certainly have the effect of exorcising the demon in her daughter. No wonder, if this is the case, Jesus didn't have to go to her and heal her. Miraculous in the traditional sense? maybe not so much, but certainly a miracle. So what about the deaf and mute man, I thought? In the first century, they probably just knew that he was deaf and mute. And they probably stopped there. They didn't have, our modern medical system has significant flaws, and this was 2,000 years ago. Not only that, people were not valued the way they are today, so he was just a guy that didn't speak and didn't hear. But what if, instead of a physical problem, it was a mental problem? What if he was a trauma survivor? Certainly, that was very likely in the first century. In fact, just reading about the first century, I think it's likely that everyone was walking around with some level of PTSD. It was a tough time. Jesus takes him away privately, and again, I imagine they talked more than is reported, because Mark is very brief. He just gives you the basics and moves on. Paper was really expensive. It was designed to be read in church, not studied in a library for hours and hours. What if Jesus was just the first to see this man as he was? What if Jesus healed him through talking the way counselors and psychologists have just in the last 200 years, 100 years even, have just recently learned to do? And what better counselor than the mighty counselor, the Prince of Peace? Miraculous. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but certainly a miracle. And then there's the feeding of the 4,000. And I've always got a bit of a chip on my shoulder with the feeding miracles. Even with first century food insecurity, people knew that they needed food and water in the desert. It was a life-threatening thing. These were desert people, think Bedouins. Anybody that's seen Alec Guinness, Middle East movie, Lawrence of Arabia. Anybody that's seen Lawrence of Arabia, that's the culture that we're picturing, right? Even with first century food insecurity, they would have known that they needed to bring some food to the desert, otherwise they were going to die. And as we read in John a few weeks ago, and you shouldn't judge Mark by John, but that's what I'm going to do here. Much of the people who wanted Jesus to feed them, they weren't looking for a meal ticket. They weren't looking for a Messiah. They were looking for a meal ticket. They wanted manna. They didn't want salvation. And Jesus called them out on it. So if you want to be fed, and you're a crowd of 4,000 supposedly very hungry people, how safe is it to pull out the bread that you brought in front of them? You're not going to get that bread, are you? Probably not very safe. But what if Jesus somehow convinced the people there was enough food? If he could convince them to just be a little more peaceful, be a little more trusting, surely their own food would come out. Miraculous in the traditional sense? Maybe not. But definitely a miracle. And this is all sandwiched between two stories of the Pharisees hassling Jesus. The same Pharisees who were upset that Jesus healed on the Sabbath rather than just being happy that he healed, period. The same Pharisees who were more concerned with being seen ritually washing before the meal than what it actually meant. Jesus says it flat out when they question him by quoting Isaiah. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. Here's the thing I'm thinking about. If we set Jesus' miracles up as something that only Jesus can do, I think it diminishes them. Sure, it honors Jesus by setting him up on a pedestal, but it also sets us up to not try. And Jesus, first and foremost, was a teacher. He was a rabbi. He was training disciples to go out and make disciples of everybody else. Disciples that he clearly taught to perform miracles. So what I'm saying today, it's really just an experiment. And I like thinking about things like this. I wanted to model feeling comfortable about our faith from different angles to just see what might fall out if we shake that tree. But I also thought setting miracles up on a pedestal for only Jesus can lead to an action, I thought that was an interesting thought. So the question is, who would want to change the message? But it's not really the question, because Mark gives us the answer clearly. The Pharisees. The people more concerned about being seen doing the right thing, but not actually doing anything. I talk a lot about this, but we also have to remember that Christianity became the state church of Rome not much later, and it remained a global power up until the last 50 years. Did the Christians win a victory by winning over Rome? Or was it a hostile takeover? If it was a hostile takeover by people interested in power, then a message that only Jesus can take action is pretty useful. So these are my closing questions for you to think about this week. What can you do to build the kingdom that you thought was above you? What miracles can you perform? Or have you already performed? And maybe the harder question, why might you not want to perform miracles?